You're starting, are you
Oh,
starting?
yeah.
I am. Okay.
Camera's rolling just for my own sake. You can begin whenever you're ready.
Well, gentlemen, quite a joy to have this conversation today. I have to say, it's a little intimidating. I think it was 2 years ago. We were with Pastor Peterson in Montana and with Dr. Nestingen last winter in Arizona. And I can say with great confidence I have nothing to offer like those gentlemen. And so I was really thoroughly blown away when you asked that we would have this conversation today. So probably what I'd like to do is to make this a genuinely collegial conversation, since this is a collegium. And I'll have a few things to offer you as by way of my own perspectives, but all along what I've really appreciated about this group is the insight and perspectives and the contributions that all of you have made. So, with that, to kind of launch into my own perspective, now looking back on 45 years of ministry, I want to tell a story. I think Brian likes stories, right? So, when I was a kid, I had a goal of being a band teacher. As you know, I love music. And so, growing up on a farm, I had that kind of in my sights all along. And then I went to a youth conference meeting. In those days we had the Walther League. And this gentleman, Jim Rosbach was his name, who was very active as an adult leader in the youth program, announced he was going to seminary. So I was kind of interested in that. He had a good career in broadcasting at the time. What would lead him to go to the seminary? So I asked him about it, and he said, you know, I think maybe you have the gifts to be a pastor. That was a little intimidating to me. I mean, as a little kid, I had played church, actually preaching to my dad's cows in the barn. That's another story. But to actually take up the task of being a pastor, to prepare a sermon every Sunday. I'm not that kind of an outgoing person. I could not see myself doing that. But I said, well, maybe we'll give it a shot. Talked to my parents. I said, yeah, I think you should try this. So we're now on the cusp of the Vietnam War, so the draft is involved here. And going to college in preparation for the ministry, that's a special deferment. You had to sign an official agreement, a statement of intent that you intended to go into the holy ministry that enabled you to have a different ranking in the draft. So a lot of my friends are being drafted for the war at that time. So this weighed upon my conscience a great deal. So, do you really want to be a pastor, or is this kind of an easy out? So weighing through this, no, I'd like to give this a try, but I really don't know that I could ever really be a pastor. Could I really muster all the things that were necessary to do that? I said, well, it's a declaration of an intent. It's for 1 year, and it has to be renewed after a year, so I'll give it a shot. Signed the agreement, turned it in, went to school. Next year, another declaration of intent. Well, I can give it another year with confidence. And here I am, 45 years later, giving it another year, 1 year at a time. But looking back, you see God's grace, working richly. It's like the apostle saying, to me, who is less than the least of all the saints, this grace is given, that I should be one who preaches the unsearchable riches of Christ. And from my perspective, that's really what it's all about. It's grace at work. Certainly not an accomplishment. I'm all too much aware of my failures, things I could have done differently and should have done better. But God's mercies are new every morning, and on the strength of that, I get up each day and give it another try. by God's grace. And so as I look at anything that I've been able to do, or certainly to offer you gentlemen, it's been that. It's been God's grace at work in my life. So I think that receptive posture, if there's anything that strikes me, is that receptive posture is key to being having something to offer. I can't give away what I don't have. And I see myself, especially now, as I've looked more consciously at the art of the care of souls, it really involves being a channel for something you receive from God, rather than bringing something to offer this particular soul from within you. When I look back on my own career, those times when I've tried to make things happen by my own ingenuity, even my theological aptitudes, or even convictions, I fall really very, very short. Sometimes I fall flat on my face. But to the extent I'm able to see myself as a channel, bringing the gifts of Christ to individuals, that's when, number one, I feel more relaxed, more confident. And I think quite honestly, as I look at the results, I think what Jesus does is much better than what I do. So, I don't know if that makes any sense to you. On the basis of that, I think maybe we could continue the conversation. Yeah.
Building on exactly what you just said there, at one time you said that you thought that the best that you could give to your people, especially when you were a young pastor, is your love and compassion for them. But yet you found that to be a heresy, to give your love and compassion, everything that you have.
Mm-hmm.
How is it as a pastor, a young pastor, even into your older years as a pastor, your more experience, how do you find that as both a challenge then, maybe even a burden to you, but how that evolved into not as much the giving of your love and compassion, but the giving of Christ's love and compassion? How had that affected you as a young pastor? How did you learn from it?
Mm-hmm.
How did you continue to focus on the love and compassion of Christ instead of your own?
Mm-hmm.
And how did that make a difference for you in your ministry?
It's an important question. I think, first of all, I'd like to say very clearly that when I wrote that, I did not mean to say that a pastor should be dispassionate or somehow cool or off-putting or reserved or standoffish. I think we need to be very much engaged with what's before us, and we need to enter into that with our whole heart. But my fallacy, I think, in the beginning was I saw my compassion as the source of comfort for the individual. And having grown a great deal, sometimes by failure, frankly, and finding myself depleted, I believe I have more to give in the compassion department, now that I know where it comes from. I don't think I'm any less loving, if anything, probably more, but as a channel of Christ's love rather than as one who is trying to bring consolation to people from my own affection, my own understanding, my own empathy. So again, one little story. My very first funeral, this gentleman, a very prominent farmer in our community, our small town, unfortunately, he and his wife had lost two sons, one in Vietnam and one tragically to cancer. So there had already been two traumatic deaths in the family. And so he entered the hospital for what seemed to be a routine thing. I was out actually going ice fishing with my father-in-law at the time, and suddenly comes a snowmobile out on the ice, and said, "Pastor, Ernie died." Well, I just visited him like an hour before. So this is a shock to me. I'm going through the Rolodex of, okay, what did they tell me about funeral plannings and all this kind of thing, and So you go into emergency gear, and by God's grace, I got through that. We had to borrow the biggest church in the community because our little church would not, people wouldn't fit in there. And somewhere in the depths of my file cabinet, I probably have that first funeral sermon written out. But I remember distinctly going through that whole thing with a widow, and he had some older children, some younger children. So being with them day by day by day through this horrific shock that they went through, and the whole community is grieving with them. I even think back and I remember what it was like standing in the pulpit, seeing them down there in the row and the whole church full of people. At the very end of that, I literally collapsed into the arms of an elder. I just absolutely had nothing left to give. Was I an effective pastor? I think so. Were the people helped? Yes. Were they helped by God? Yes. But internally, I think I was immersing myself too much into their pain, thinking that my immersing myself into that would help them. I was partially right. They need someone to share their pain. But thankfully, the Lord Jesus has already done that, and I can do it more effectively, not less effectively, by seeing myself as a channel of His love and His compassion. So, what I meant by saying that's a heresy to think that I'm not the Savior. So it's like Chrysostom said, the church already has a husband. She doesn't need two. She needs the best man to bring her the gifts of Christ. And the more I've learned that over the years, I think the more able I am to actually